Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
Here is the part that still makes my chest tighten when I say it out loud, because it sounds ridiculous until you remember my family has a talent for making the ridiculous feel normal. I found out about the family road trip the night before they left. Not because anyone called me, not because someone thought I should pack a bag, but because my cousin posted a picture of the packed trunk with one of those chirpy captions about fresh starts and family time, and when I asked my mother what was going on, she took a long breath and said, very calmly, that my brother did not want me around and they did not want to start drama, so they thought it would be better if I sat this one out, and in that moment I realized I had not been left out by accident. I had been voted off the island with a smile. I tried to stay measured, because yelling never gets me anywhere with them, and because I wanted to be sure I was hearing this right, so I asked whether I had done something specific or whether my presence was just inconvenient in a general way. And my mother said it was not about blame, it was about keeping the peace, and my father, who can talk for hours when it is about my brother's latest big idea, said nothing at all, which somehow felt louder than anything my mother had said, and the silence told me exactly where I stood. I told them it was pretty bold to make this decision, and then asked me to understand it like we were all reasonable people making a careful plan. And my mother slipped into that soothing tone she uses when she is selling something that benefits my brother and costs me, and she said they would bring me back a little gift, and we would do something just the three of us later. As if a candle from a roadside shop could make the message go away, the one that said I am optional, I am extra, I am only welcome when it costs them nothing. What landed the hardest was the way the reason came wrapped in concern, because I know that tactic, I grew up with it. My brother, Ethan, gets to be fragile and complicated and easily triggered, and I get to be flexible, understanding, and endlessly patient, which is a nice way of saying that he gets the boundaries and I get the work, and it has been this way since we were kids. He breaks the rules and I fix the mood. He makes a mess and I bring the towels. He snaps and I apologize for how sharply the air felt in his direction. I did not say that part on the phone, because there is no point throwing old history at people who have no interest in remembering it, but I thought about last year when I helped pay for the rental because Ethan was having a rough time. And I thought about all the small things I have done because my parents asked me to be the bigger person, and I thought about how being the bigger person only works when the other person is at least trying to grow, and it hit me that they were not asking me to be bigger this time, they were asking me to be invisible. So I said I hoped they had a nice trip, and I meant it in the way you wish someone who blocked you in the grocery store a nice day, because I did not want anything bad to happen to them. I just wanted the truth to sit uncomfortably in the back seat with them the whole way, and then I hung up before I said something I could not take back, because the temptation was right there on my tongue. I walked around my place thinking about how quickly they had decided I was the problem to be managed, and I could feel that sharp, clean kind of anger that makes you calm instead of wild, the kind that lines things up in your head and shows you where your choices are. And I knew I could either spend the next week replaying the conversation until I scraped myself raw, or I could do something that put weight back in my hands. So I went to the little list I keep of the bills I cover that are not technically mine, but have been mine because I am the dependable one, and I saw the gas card my brother uses when he needs to get across town. A card I opened when he was between jobs and forgot to close when he stopped being between jobs, a card that had quietly become yet another way I subsidize the story where he is the center and I am the support staff. And I sat there for a minute and stared at it until the choice felt obvious. I called the company and, in the same calm tone my mother had used on me, I closed the account and paid the balance to zero, and it was such a small action compared to the size of the hurt. But the minute the representative said the card would be inactive within the hour, I felt a click inside, like something had finally aligned. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but a tiny reset of the math that had always been off. I did not text anyone a warning, because clearly we were not doing courtesy notifications this week, and I told myself that if they could plan a family trip around a grown man's preferences, they could handle a little inconvenience without collapsing. And then I poured some water and tried to breathe like a normal person who had not just watched her family choose comfort over fairness again. And that is when a thought surfaced, slow and steady, The kind of thought that does not depend on anyone's permission, a thought about a set of keys that are not in my brother's name, a tax bill that does not arrive at my parents' address, and a deed that has only one signature on it, mine, and I realized there was a reason I was suddenly very calm, because if they did not want me around, they had forgotten one very important detail that was about to decide whether that comfort they protected so carefully could survive the week. When I say they forgot about the house, I do not mean they literally lost track of it like a set of keys. I mean they got so comfortable with a story where my brother deserves safety, and I supply it, that they stopped noticing the parts that made that safety possible. Which is how a place I bought after a rough breakup and a scramble of savings turned into his default address, his storage unit, his proof of adulthood, while I paid the property taxes and the insurance premiums and the maintenance calls that eat weekends, because years ago my mother asked me to help him get on his feet for a few months, and I said yes, and then the months stretched until they felt like a permanent season nobody bothered to name. I can still remember the conversation when I agreed to let him stay, because my mother pitched it like a short bridge over a small gap, something everyone would appreciate, and then we would all move on. And my father added that it would be smart to keep the deed in my name because paperwork is complicated and Ethan is not great with forms, and I remember telling myself that this was a grown-up decision and that families carry each other through rough spots. And I did not notice how easily my generosity got rebranded as a duty, and then as an obligation, and then as a baseline, until even casual comments at dinner shifted from your place to his house, and every time I corrected them my mother smiled like I was being technical and unkind. Which is a neat trick if you want to make someone feel guilty for remembering reality. I never asked him for rent because the first few months were rocky, and I did not want to be the reason he stumbled. And then when he had steady work the topic felt radioactive, because my parents had trained me to believe that bringing up money creates drama, while ignoring money preserves love. So instead of invoices, I kept screenshots and emails and little digital breadcrumbs that reminded me who actually covered the leaks and the appliance failures and the tax bill that always arrives at the most inconvenient time. And those records were not revenge trophies. They were the only way I could keep myself from believing the rewritten version where he was the provider and I was the difficult sister who did not applaud loudly enough. The night of the road trip news, I opened the folder with the closing documents and the deed and the title insurance and the old inspection report, and I sat there looking at my own name printed again and again. And it felt less like a victory and more like a wake-up call, because the problem was not that I did not have power. The problem was that I kept refusing to use it out of habit and fear of being labeled the mean one. And I realized that every time I swallowed something unfair, I gave them permission to ask me to swallow more, which is how you end up being the person who funds the comfort of people who will not even send you an itinerary. I wanted to make sure I was not about to do something reckless, so I called the attorney who handled my closing and asked a lot of questions in a calm voice that did not match the storm in my stomach, and he explained what I already suspected. That as the owner I could sell the property and that any occupant without a formal lease would be considered month to month, which meant there were notices and timelines and steps that a buyer could handle if I preferred not to be in the middle of it, and hearing it laid out like a checklist made the air feel less heavy, because I was not plotting a stunt. I was making a decision about an asset I had carried by myself for years while being told to be grateful for the privilege of carrying it. I did not want a circus with photos online and yard signs that would tip off my parents before I was ready, so I called a friend from college, Lena, who now works with investors who buy quietly when speed matters more than squeezing every last dollar. And I told her I wanted this done without drama, and she asked the question every professional asks, whether the occupant knew, and I said no, and she said that was my call, but that we could structure the sale so the buyer accepted the situation and handled the paperwork and the notices, and I realized I had been waiting for someone neutral to tell me I was not crazy for being done. It would be easy to say I felt triumphant right then, but what I actually felt was relief with a sharp edge, because the minute I allowed myself to imagine a future where I was no longer underwriting my brother's comfort, I could also imagine the outrage that would follow, the phone calls, the accusations, the rehearsed speeches about loyalty, and I knew they would try to make me feel like a traitor to a team that had benched me on purpose. which is why I needed the next step to be simple and final and not open to debate. So I told Lena to run her numbers and send me the paperwork that would start the process and keep my name out of the local rumor mill, and while she talked through timelines and title checks and cash offers that close fast, I felt the same click I felt when I shut down that gas card, only louder, because this was not a warning shot, this was a line, and I was finally willing to stand on the side of it that protected me, and when we hung up I did not text my parents a thing, because if they could plan a family vacation around a grown man's hurt feelings, then I could plan a transaction around my own dignity, and by the time their trip ended there would already be a document in my inbox waiting for one signature that had always been mine. The strangest thing about making the decision was how ordinary the process felt once I finally allowed myself to cross the line I had been staring at for years, because in my head it had always been this dramatic showdown with screaming and tears and slammed doors. Yet in practice, it was a set of emails, a handful of phone calls, and a signature on a document that quietly shifted everything, and the lack of spectacle made it almost more powerful, as if I had slipped a piece out of the game. Bored while everyone else was distracted, and by the time they noticed the rules would already be different. The morning after I spoke with Lena, she sent me the first packet with the disclosures and the outline of what a cash buyer would offer, and even though she assured me the numbers were solid and the process would move quickly, I found myself reading the documents 3 times over, partly because I wanted to be certain I was not missing anything, and partly because my brain could not fully accept that years of being cast as the side character in my own family story could tilt this suddenly, and with so little effort from me beyond a clear yes. I kept thinking about the trip they were on, the cheerful photos I avoided clicking on, the image of my brother stretched across the back seat while my parents pretended they were the type of family that solved problems by spending time together. And I thought about how carefully they had edited me out of that picture, and it gave me the push I needed to stop hesitating. I signed the first set of documents digitally, and when the confirmation email landed in my inbox it felt like proof that the power I had been handing away all these years was never gone, just waiting for me to stop apologizing and pick it back up. I remember sitting very still afterward, half expecting some wave of guilt to rush in, because that has always been the soundtrack of my choices when they go against the script my family prefers, but the guilt never came, at least not in the way I was used to. What came instead was a sense of finality, like I had just closed a door that had been left open so long I no longer remembered it had hinges, and with the click of that door I knew there was no walking it back. No pretending I could just undo it later when everyone was calmer, because the wheels were already in motion. During the week that followed, I went about my days almost normally, but underneath every errand and every work call was the awareness that my brother was living in a house whose future had already been sealed without his knowledge. I am not proud to admit there were moments when I felt almost giddy at the thought, not because I enjoy hurting him, but because for once the imbalance was tilting in my direction. And for once I was the one holding information that would shape his reality instead of the other way around. Still, there were also hours when I questioned whether this was too much, whether I could have just asked him to leave or demanded rent or forced a conversation with my parents instead of setting the entire structure on fire. But each time those doubts came, I reminded myself of the road trip, of the calm way my mother had told me my presence was disposable, and of the decades of being told to be patient while he took up all the oxygen in the room, and the doubts quieted down. When the buyer's offer came in, higher than I had expected and with a timeline that would close in less than a month, I realized the countdown had started, and I also realized my family had no idea they were already living inside that countdown. I could almost hear the explosion coming, the phone calls, the outrage, the words like betrayal and disloyalty, but this time I felt strangely insulated, as if all of that noise was a storm I could watch through glass. Because the reality was that the house was mine and the sale was legal and their outrage would be nothing more than volume, loud but powerless. On the day they returned from their trip, I let my phone ring without picking up, because I already knew what was waiting on the other end. My brother had discovered the paperwork through a notice slipped under the door or maybe a message from the buyer's agent, and his voice filled my voicemail with a level of fury that almost made me laugh, because the words he threw at me, selfish, cruel, vindictive, were the same words I had been quietly swallowing about him for years, and hearing them hurled back at me felt like a strange kind of justice. I did not return his call. I did not text to explain. I let the silence stretch, because for once it was not my job to soothe the chaos, and because explaining would only invite more demands to undo what was already irreversible. That night my parents started calling too, alternating between my mother's soft, pleading voice and my father's clipped anger, and though I knew their outrage would only escalate from here, I could not shake the calm running under everything. Because the decision was no longer theoretical, it was signed, stamped, and moving forward whether they approved or not, and every time the phone lit up with their names I felt the confirmation of what I had done, and the knowledge that the storm had finally shifted directions and was about to break straight over their heads instead of mine. The first time my phone lit up with my brother's name after he realized what was happening, I let it ring until the voicemail kicked in, because I knew there was nothing to say that would land anywhere other than as ammunition for his anger. And when I listened back later, the message was a mix of shouting and half-coherent threats about what he would do if I did not reverse everything immediately, as if selling a house were a simple button I could press again to make his comfort magically return, and the part that struck me most was not even the words, but the entitlement underneath them, the certainty that my choices were supposed to orbit around him the way my parents had taught me to orbit since we were kids. My mother called next, her tone carefully measured, the same calm cadence she always uses when she is packaging a demand as an appeal for harmony, and she said things like, "You know how sensitive your brother is, and we could have worked this out together," and "Family shouldn't turn on family," and I sat there listening to the voicemail replaying the phrases over and over, noticing how the script had not changed even when the stakes were now higher than they had ever been, because somehow it was still about me being the bigger person and them protecting his feelings, as though my role was to absorb the cost of his life indefinitely without daring to complain. My father's message was shorter, more clipped, but no less familiar. His voice carried that disappointment he wears like armor, saying that I had made a reckless, selfish choice that put the family in turmoil, and that I should have come to them before doing something so extreme, and I found myself almost laughing at how casually he erased the fact that they had cut me out of the family trip without coming to me first. The following days blurred into a series of ignored calls, furious texts, and scattered attempts at guilt-tripping that ranged from dramatic warnings about how I was destroying relationships to quiet digs about how I clearly had not learned the value of loyalty. And with each message, I felt the odd combination of dread and liberation that comes when you finally stop bending under a weight you never chose to carry. I will not lie. There were moments when I felt sick with nerves, moments when I wondered if I had finally gone too far and handed them the story they had always wanted, the one where I was the difficult daughter who ruined everything. But then I would open the folder with the deed, see my name printed there, and remember that the only thing I had done was reclaim what was already mine. Ethan's rage hit its peak about 3 days after he realized the sale was real and irreversible. He left me a string of messages threatening legal action, insisting he would fight me in court, and demanding that I think about how this would look to the rest of the family when the truth came out. But the truth was already out. It was just a truth he did not like. He never had a lease, never paid a dime in rent, and had no legal standing, and the more I reminded myself of that fact, the easier it became to let the phone buzz without reacting. It was strange to realize that for years I had been the one afraid of confrontation, the one smoothing things over, when in reality they were the fragile ones, the ones who fell apart the minute they lost control over the narrative. By the end of the week, the texts shifted from anger to desperation. My mother wrote long messages about how he had nowhere else to go, how he was not equipped to handle this, how it would crush him to be displaced, and every word was designed to press the bruise of guilt she has always known how to find in me. She wrote about how I was better with money, better with responsibility, better with holding things together, as though competence were a curse that meant I owed them eternal servitude, and for the first time in my life I let myself reject that logic completely. Being capable did not mean I was required to carry a grown man on my back forever, and their inability to see that was not my problem anymore. The day I signed the final set of documents was almost anticlimactic compared to the storm around me. I clicked through the digital forms, reviewed the final numbers, typed my name, and with one more confirmation the deal was sealed. The property would transfer in just a couple of weeks, and all the responsibility that had been mine alone would finally lift. The moment the confirmation email landed in my inbox, I sat back and thought about how many times over the years I had fantasized about what it would feel like to stop being the safety net, and though I expected a rush of triumph, what I actually felt was something steadier and more profound: peace. I told myself that now the hardest part was done, that they would eventually stop shouting once the reality settled in, that their anger would burn itself out and leave nothing but silence between us, and I could live with that. But I underestimated just how far my parents were willing to go when their version of family order was disrupted. Because just when I thought they would retreat into icy distance, they proved me wrong. It was a Saturday afternoon, ordinary enough that I had almost convinced myself life might go back to normal, when my doorbell rang, and when I glanced through the peephole my stomach dropped so fast I thought I might actually be sick, because there they were, my parents, standing together with expressions that told me this would not be a conversation I could simply silence with the ignore button. And in that moment I realized the fallout was not finished, not even close. It was only beginning, and this time it would not be contained to voicemails or text messages. I opened the door because leaving them on the step would only give them more material about how cold and ungrateful I am, and since I had already decided to stop playing the villain in a story they kept rewriting, I told them we could talk if they kept their voices down and stuck to facts. And when my father started in with the rehearsed lecture about loyalty and respect, I lifted my hand and said this would not be a tribunal where I sit and nod while they justify decisions that were already made without me. So either we use the time to deal with what exists or we take a rain check. And to my surprise they sat, which felt like the first honest moment we had shared in years. My mother started with the soft version because that is her lane, telling me she understood I was hurt, but that selling the house was an extreme reaction to a misunderstanding, and that if I had come to them they would have found a compromise. Something like a temporary rent or a timeline that eased Ethan into a new place, and I let her finish, because interrupting would only feed the script where I am unreasonable. Then I said that the trip was not a misunderstanding, it was a choice, and that the house was not a bargaining chip, it was my property that I had carried alone for years while being told to prioritize peace over fairness. And if anyone wanted to talk about extreme reactions, we should start with the part where I was removed from a family event because a grown man did not want to manage his feelings while sharing a car. My father leaned forward with that stern look I used to accept as authority and told me I had humiliated my brother and put him in a position that would be very difficult to recover from, and I said that was the point of accountability, which is not cruelty but cause and effect, and since we were on the subject of recovery, I had already handled what they would accuse me of ignoring, because I had secured a simple plan that required nothing from them except honesty with Ethan. And I slid a plain folder across the table the way you slide a bill in a diner when it is time to stop arguing about whose turn it is. Inside the folder was a short letter I wrote in clear, steady language explaining that the sale was final and not up for discussion, followed by a confirmation for a small apartment across town that was clean and basic and already approved in his name with the first 3 months prepaid by me on the condition that he sign the lease himself and set up his own utilities. And there was also a 1-page agreement stating that after those months he would either keep paying on his own or vacate, and that I would provide no further financial support of any kind, no gas cards, no secret bills, no emergency cushions disguised as sisterly favors, and that any contact with me going forward would be respectful and limited to logistics until trust could be rebuilt. My mother blinked at the papers like they were written in a language she did not speak, then asked why I would do something so cold as putting conditions on family, and I said the conditions were the only reason I could do anything at all. Because without them I would be back where I started, carrying a man who refuses to walk, and that this arrangement gave him dignity because it required him to stand up and handle the boring parts of adulthood, while also giving me a clean exit from the role I never signed up for, and if they wanted to call that cold they were free to, but what I felt was clarity for the first time in a very long time. My father asked whether I was prepared for them to choose Ethan over me if I forced this line, and I said I had been living with that choice my entire life, only now it had a name, and then I added something I had never said out loud, which is that I had documented every payment and repair and tax bill, not to weaponize the past, but to protect my sanity, and that if they tried to smear me to the extended family, I would share the summary without commentary and let people draw their own conclusions, and the quiet that followed was the kind you hear when a bluff gets called and everyone realizes the table is finally level. They wanted me to promise that the buyer would slow down, that I would at least delay the closing to give Ethan more time, and I said the timeline was already locked and that I would not reopen it, because I had learned that every extension becomes a new baseline and every favor becomes proof that I will always give one more, and that the only way to end a pattern is to end it, not to taper it until it morphs back into itself. And I could see the moment they understood that I was not negotiating anymore, that this was not a performance to be reversed once they wore me down, that the door I had closed in my head was now a real door with a lock they did not have a key to. Before they left, I told them something I had been saving for last, because I wanted it to land without noise, which was that I would not chase them or explain myself to cousins or neighbors or anyone else. That if they needed a version of me that fit the old story, they were free to keep it. But if they wanted a relationship with the real me, they would have to accept boundaries that are not up for debate. And then I handed my mother a second copy of the apartment confirmation and asked her to give it to Ethan with the simple message that this was his chance to start as an adult or to refuse and face the consequences as an adult, and whichever path he chose would be his decision, not mine. They stood there at the door like they were waiting for me to take it all back, and for a second I could feel the old habit tugging at me, the reflex to soften and apologize and make their discomfort easier to carry, and I almost laughed at how familiar it felt. Like muscle memory, you do not even notice until you try to move differently. Then I said I loved them, and I meant it, but I loved myself enough to stop being the person they call when they want something invisible and heavy moved. Without a sound, and I closed the door gently, and the quiet that followed did not feel like an ending so much as the first stable minute of a life I was finally running. Which is why when my phone buzzed a little while later and Ethan's name flashed across the screen, I let it ring and kept breathing, because the next move is not mine anymore, and that is the win I had been working toward without even realizing it.